Can you just?
All the things that we do there and kind of.
I'm gonna watch the button that you push.
The check mark,
Okay.
check mark, check mark.
You know what I mean?
That's not good. Then go to audio. Yep. Right now we're good. Yep. All right. We're just got Rich.
Well, I think it's recorded, so you can always.
Right, oh, good, right. So I did. I saw the new. Yeah, well, that's nice.
That's what this is.
Yeah, we talked about it, and then Apple and I looked at it after the meeting, it's like, are you? So it'll be cool.
That would have been bad.
It should be on the group.
Yeah.
After, yeah.
Oh, yeah, are you feeling good?
I'm still,
Better?
oh, yeah, I'm better, but I know, yeah.
Olivia, what are your other- my house. Like, stay there, and don't go out. Spray, and then I just spray every day.
That's pretty much what Joe did.
Oh, so I thought, were you happy?
No, but I had the other.
Yeah, she has both.
Yeah.
It's horrible. It's okay, yes. I'm glad you said it.
Yes, thank you.
No, you're telling yourself. I just.
All right, guys, are we ready? I don't wanna keep everybody. Gina, thanks for printing those. I think Gina's gonna get everybody a copy in case you wanna make notes. And those of you on Zoom, if you have a copy, great. If not, You can print a copy. Or you can follow along here online. So I'm actually pretty excited about this new purchase agreement. I know
I'm gonna
that
put them up
our
here if anyone needs any copy.
old purchase agreement that we had for a short time kind of stunk. So I think that we've taken what we had previously, what we had previous to that, added a few things and came up with this one. So I will shout out to Deb Jarvis too, because she really helped put all this together as far as the boxes and got it ready for Donald, which was huge. And she helped look at it and proofread, because I can proofread it so many times and I still have mess ups. I think Lynette, did you do a pass at this?
I did it, but
Okay. But
I
I
have
had,
notes.
okay, I had Melissa Sanford do a pass, so if there are mistakes, we'll try and fix them, but it should be pretty good, because we've had quite a few people look at it, so. We'll go ahead and get started. Now, usually when I do this class, I don't go over each line, I go over paragraphs or just the blanks. I'm gonna try and go over pretty much every page, because there are some significant differences in this purchase agreement that you haven't had before, which I would say, I think are benefits to the client. So, all right, so not much changed on the first two lines, really just address, parcel number, fine, purchase agreement, earnest money. The biggest change there is we put that the earnest money has to be within 72 hours, made within 72 hours. And I think that that was a big difference, because the law currently just says as soon as practical, but as soon as possible also. So it's one of those things where, well, what is as soon as possible? If I live in California, can I mail the check? And by the time I do the home inspection, you haven't got it, I cancel the check. Problem. With today's day and age of everything being online, there really isn't a reason why somebody's writing a check, not that they can't, but there really isn't a reason that they shouldn't just go online and pay through earnest on one of the title company websites, but 72 hours. So the reason that that's important is just because you now also have to know that since you're the one writing this, that your client has 72 hours to turn it in. So you gotta follow up with them and make sure that you're getting it, and it's getting to where it needs to go. Be careful with earnest money. It used to be one of the biggest problems of the Division of Real Estate with complaints. It is not the #1 problem anymore. However, I am still seeing problems from a brokerage perspective, because we have agents that will collect the earnest money, hold on to it for 3 weeks, and then they mail it and it doesn't get where it's supposed to go and it's not tracked. So think of earnest money as if it was cash, because that's what it is. It is somebody's cash and it's not yours and it's not mine. So we need to make sure that we're getting it to wherever it needs to go in a very safe fashion. So whether that's tracking and it's an overnight, whether it's you hand delivering it, or you not touching it at all and saying to your buyer, hey, pay it online, or you deliver it to the title company. I know we want to be accommodating, but please be careful with that, because I am seeing more problems with earnest money not being where it's supposed to get to. Of course, balance of down payment, that most of these are pretty simple. We're used to these. The next biggest change is lines 12 through 14. So we had some thoughts on the fact that we didn't need to make our offers not contingent upon commission. And so we just changed it to say the seller agrees to pay the buyer's broker commission at closing. The commission will be blank of the purchase price. Now, if that blank is not a percent for some reason, that's fine. Expand that box over the sign there for percent and put a cash amount in there. So it can be interchangeable, but typically we see a percent, and that's why we wrote it that way. But of the purchase price, you'll notice we got rid of the double.
Thank God, because
Yeah.
people were so confused.
It was
on some
super
of that.
confusing.
Yeah.
Yep, so we got rid of that. That's no longer there. It's just the commission percent based on the purchase price. And it specifically states that the agent is instructed to deduct it from the commissions and pay directly to the buyer's broker. So we got rid of the clunkiness, hopefully, in that paragraph. Lines 15 through 17, they're a little bit smaller, but basically all it says is that the escrow officer is allowed, they direct the escrow officer to confirm receipt, because what's happening is most title companies are pretty good about emailing everybody to say, hey, I've got the earnest money. But if you don't get it, you don't know that it was ever received by the title company. So this is just saying, hey, we're giving the escrow agent instructions. When you get the earnest money, please email the parties and let everybody know. If you don't get an email within, I would say, if we're saying 72 hours, if you don't have something within 5 business days, there's a problem. Right? You need to reach out to your client and figure out where that earnest money is, no matter which end of the transaction you're on. But that just says that anything that, of course, over $10,000 has to be wired. We don't often see that happen for earnest money, but that's just a note there. We left in secondary offer because it seems that with this market, we are seeing a little bit more secondary offers. I'm seeing more clients showing house or more clients willing to see a house that's been under contract for a while. And we're also seeing contingent offers, which we haven't seen in a while. So rather than have a whole separate addendum for it, the secondary offer is only if you are making this as a secondary offer. It is or it is not a secondary offer. Okay. And then it would be, you would have a signed copy of a primary release on or before whatever the date would be. So that's your period that your offer would extend up until, and then it expires if the seller can't perform. Okay. Financing, still pretty standard. We left in there that they have 5 weekdays to make a written loan application. We still left in loan commitment, which would be on line 25. Loan commitment is usually only within a matter of, I'm going to say 3 to 5 days before closing. You are not seeing this 3 to 5 days after writing the offer. You're not seeing this within 20 days after writing the offer. This is within like 3 to 5 days of closing date. So if I have a closing date of 45 days, I'm going to say maybe 43 days is where, you know, my commitment is going to be. So that's what I would fill on line 25. But it depends on your lender. It depends on how long you're closing. Are you doing a 60-day close, a 45-day close, a 30-day close? But I can tell you, it should always be within 3 to 5 days of the closing, not writing the offer. I've seen agents write in there 3 days from date of acceptance. Well, good luck. You're not getting a loan. You don't even have a loan application, let alone commitment, right? So.
And you don't want it to go as long as you've set, let's say you have a 30-day close, you don't wanna say 30 days because you need it to be done
It
before
really
that,
should
so that
be
you
done
get your
before that.
speedy-
Well, you're clear to close.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. Mhm. Okay, and then on line 30, it would just be any kind of a credit. Now, this is where the commission can go if your buyer is asking the seller to pay a commission, but as closing costs, they want the credit and they're gonna pay you. Or it could just be for closing costs. It could also be zero. Your buyer may not be asking for any closing costs, right? But that's all that line 30 is for, is really just expenses that they're asking the seller to pay. So maybe they're asking them to pay down their interest rate or, you know, point or something like that. That's where that would go. And then line 34 is just not to exceed whatever a cost would be for VA or FHA repairs. Has nothing to do with the home inspection. That's just VA repairs or FHA repairs. So some of this is pretty standard. There are other changes that are in this. And that is basically, we did leave that if the closing date for some reason needs to be extended, that it can't exceed 14 additional days, but it automatically is given, it's agreed to up front that you have 14 extra days. If it is a government, maybe, you know, when the government shut down for a little bit, we were delayed. It could be, let's say you're doing a City of Canton down payment program and the City of Canton or OFA needs more time in order to approve the loan. Things like that. It's not because the buyer said, oh, don't do the appraisal yet because I want to wait till after the home inspection. And now they've delayed the entire process. That's not what that's designed for. That is designed for a lender or some type of government lender problem that they can't get closed on the day that we're supposed to. So we can go an extra 14 days, but it can't exceed that. Okay. All right, and then fixtures and equipment, we did change quite a bit of this on lines 47 through 62. So you will see that we did put in there that it is all mineral rights. I know that we had some mineral rights in our last one. This is all mineral rights if there are any, including all oil and gas rights owned by the seller. And it is subject to any existing leases of record, because sometimes a seller doesn't even know that they lease their land. You know, I know when I bought my house, there's a gas lease on it and I don't even have an acre of land. So don't ask me why, but there is. I've never seen a check for it. I know it's there. If anything ever happens, hopefully I'll be a rich person, but I'm sure that's not going to happen today. It would be subject to those. You know, I could turn that lease over to the next buyer. It could stay with me, but it really depends on what you negotiate with this contract. So with this, it's saying all mineral rights do convey. If your seller doesn't want that to happen, you better be crossing this out. So it depends on what side of the contract that you're on. We did leave a lot of different things in here. You'll see that we added some things. We just added smart and electronic devices for controlling HVAC doorbells. We kind of put that all in one along with security systems. We did add second fridge and second stove location because we are seeing those happen. I think the biggest thing to remember is when you check the box that says kitchen refrigerator, whatever refrigerator is in the kitchen, that is the kitchen refrigerator. That's what's staying with the property. There are a lot of times sellers are like, oh yeah, I'll leave a fridge. Well, when you check kitchen refrigerator and it's, you know, a French 2-door refrigerator that's $3,000 and the buyer shows up there at closing and it's a 1942 brown or green olive refrigerator, there's a problem. And buyers know the difference between the appliances that they're buying. They also look back at the pictures. We've had sellers try and switch out stoves on us, refrigerators. So when you check kitchen refrigerator, that is the refrigerator that is staying. But we've also seen where there's a bar fridge. Well, is it staying? We didn't write it in. That's the second stove. You know, maybe there's a second location in the house that has a kitchen. Is that one staying? It doesn't mean that they are just because they're in the MLS. They can be negotiated in and negotiated out. We did try and make sure that we didn't have any check boxes at the end of a sentence. Most things are in there already. So like you'll see on line 54, garage door openers and controls, if any, right? There are a lot of times anymore that there are no garage door openers that people have because they're using either their phone or they're using their car. So you have to be aware of what is in the property, what is not in the property. And have those conversations with your clients, because just because it's in here, it's if there's any, it doesn't mean that there is. Okay. Fixtures and equipment not to include, we kind of shortened that on line 63 because there are oftentimes not things that we're including. I haven't seen very many contracts where we're writing things out that are fixtures, right, for the property. And then deed in closing, we did add this back in. It would be on or before, and that's going to be the date there on line 65 for your closing. Now, I'm going to share something with you that I think is actually quite interesting. I know you all hated it, but I will say the reason that our other purchase agreement had 2 dates in it, and this one came back from the attorney with 2, and I got rid of it for your benefit, even though it's not really for your benefit. Okay, the way that we're used to doing real estate is we think that the closing date, that is our date that we want all the documents, we want everything signed, we want the money transferred, great, everybody's getting possession. But what was really the benefit of having 2 dates in there is the fact that everything could be at the escrow offices, meaning everything's at the title company by this date, right? Doesn't mean you're closing by this date. It means that the buyer has wired their money. It means that the title company has all of the funds that they're supposed to receive, including the lender's approval. But they're going to sign you 3 or 4 days later and record it. And why? Is because we need to try and get away from this where we're leaving people in a house that they don't own anymore for possession. And that would have prevented a lot of transfers, because the idea of this is I don't want to move until I know that I'm signing the papers and I have my money, right? If I move and now you're telling me that the deal fell through, I now have 2 houses possibly, or I'm homeless or whatever. So by having those 2 dates, it really was kind of a fail-safe to say this date, and then 7 days later, we'll go ahead and sign, or 5 days later, we'll go ahead and sign. You all hated that, so we got rid of it. And I know that's not how you understood it to be, and I didn't explain it that way, but I'm telling you that we might go back to that at some point. Think of that in your mind, how beneficial that would be if we actually had everything in a title company 5 days before we're actually supposed to close. How amazing would that be, instead of scrambling to, you know, at the last hour to get all the documents to everybody. So, but we went back to the 1 date. This is the date that the closing would be. And we also added back in on line 70, the deed shall be made not payable, the deed shall be made to. And that is for your benefit to talk with your clients, because I know our attorney originally said, hey, there's so many ways to take title, let the title company deal with it. And that's great, but you as an agent can provide a service to your client by saying, are you married? Do you want a joint deed with right of survivorship? Are you buying this house with your kids? Do you want joint deed with right of survivorship? That's the service that you can provide as an agent to the consumer that not all agents offer. So we thought that that was important to put that back, and I think that was, a lot of people prefer that to be in there. All right, and then possession. Some of the things that we added here are that all personal property and refuse before transfer of possession must be out. The seller must remove it. And we're adding that back in there simply because it may or may not have been in on many previous versions of our purchase agreement. I know it wasn't on the last one, or possibly even the one before that. We are seeing that people are leaving just obscene amounts of furniture and refuse behind in a property, thinking it's not a big deal. As the listing agent, I'm gonna tell you, you need to be telling your sellers, you don't leave garbage behind for other people. It's one thing to leave some paint cans and some maybe construction debris that belongs to the house as far as extra tiles and whatever. Aside from that, and some people don't even want that. Some people are like, get your paint out of here. I don't want it, right? So this is just a good conversation that you need to have. And the expectation is that when the buyer gets the property, it is broom swept and everything is gone. Unless you've negotiated something different, maybe they buying furniture or something like that, but everything needs to be removed. So that was something that we added back in there. And then evidence of title, again, this is where the escrow agent and the title company are the same. It is not two different companies. It's not a different person in a different company. Whatever is on line 79 is typically going to be on line 83. Now, I added line 83 back in because the attorney had removed it where it said escrow agent to be, simply because it was alluded to that the evidence of title, whoever that was going to be the escrow agent. I felt we needed a little bit more clarity, so I added that back in. Use it, don't use it, but just know that it's the same company.
So you don't want us to put like
Their name.
Melissa Huff as the
Nope.
escrow agent?
Nope.
You want,
It's the escrow agent's the
Okay.
title company. Yeah, the agent, the person does not matter. The actual escrow agent is the title company that's doing it. The only reason it's ever been two split up is because like there's only one that I know of here. If you've ever used Colonial Title and Blue Ridge Title, that is the difference. One of them does the title work and one of them does the escrow work. So if you know you're gonna be using Colonial Title, perhaps you could split those up, but not typically do we see that. It could also be done that, you know, for whatever reason, the buyer and seller can't agree on a title company and you are using two different title companies. But typically, the escrow company that's closing it and dispersing the funds, they really don't want to do that unless they did the title work themselves, because they don't, how do they know that the other title company did the right work? Right? They don't. They're going on blind faith. So that's why it's typically the same. Okay. All right, and then taxes, utilities, and notices. So we did put in here in bold letters that the agricultural tax recoupment is gonna be paid by the seller at closing. Now, our first purchase agreement that many of us are used to have a box that would say buyer or seller. I don't know that any agent, maybe you do, maybe you don't, fully understand what this tax recoupment is. And I'm not necessarily saying in agreement that the seller should be paying it. I would be upset if I were the seller, simply because I might say something like this. For the last 10 years I've owned this property, I have farmed it. And just because Linda comes along and says, I want to make it residential, now the county can go back and recoup up to, I think it's 2 or 3 years of the new taxable rate under the residential rate. And I was the one that got the benefit of the discount as the seller. Well, sure I did, because I was using the land for the purpose that I intended for. I have no idea what Linda intends to use it for. So I say that to you because you've got to be very careful, not necessarily when you're necessarily writing this offer for your buyer, because it's having the seller pay it. But when you're on the receiving side of our contract or anybody else's, make sure you understand who's paying that tax. Because really, as a seller, I don't know that I would want to pay the buyer's tax because they decided to use the property in a different fashion than I did. Why would that be fair? Just because I own the property then and my tax bill is 1 year in the rears, I gave the credit for the taxes that would have been owed had you not changed the land use type, right? So I will just tell you that that seems to be the way that a lot of the contracts have been going throughout the state. That's why we went ahead and followed it. It can be negotiated out just like anything else, okay? We left the water sewer hold in there, so that's on line 104. We did leave Megan's Law in there, even though that was originally taken out of the last one. I think it's important that you have that discussion with your buyers, because not all buyers know that what Megan's Law is. They don't even know that there might be sexual offenders and predators all around us when you look online, but maybe they don't want them living directly next door to them. So it is a good way for you to have communication with your clients and really looking out for their best interest, even though you're not saying, hey, a sexual offender or predator lives here. You're alerting them to where they can find that information at, okay? And then damage or destruction of the property. We left this in here because boy, did we have an issue this past year. We had, this is where it says that if a property is damaged in excess of 10% of the purchase price, the buyer can either accept the insurance proceeds and complete the transaction, or they can cancel this and get all of their money back. So you wouldn't think that this comes up very often, but we did have a house that was under contract. It was one of our listings, and it was one of our sister company's buyers. The house, a drunk driver hit the garage and knocked the part of the facade off the house, and it was a house that was built in the 60s. So it had the glazed tile, beautiful walls in the garage. They don't make that anymore. You'll see that all over here, that we have those green glazed tiles or yellowish glazed tiles in basements in the garage. They couldn't match it. There was no way to match it. And so this turned into an absolute disaster that went on for about 4 months, where the buyer and seller kept fighting about what was going to be done to the property. We finally got it. Then we fought over the paint color that was the outside of the house was going to be painted, because we couldn't match the brick. We were able to match not the color of the brick, but the size and the look. So then we had to paint the whole outside of the house to make it look right. So we're talking about $91,000 or something like that the seller was getting. And so the seller wasn't living in the house. So it was a disaster. So I will say to you, if a property is damaged during a sale, not oftentimes is the lender going to allow the buyer to close on the house, even if they say, I'm willing to accept the 10% proceeds, or I'm willing to accept the insurance money because the house is damaged more than 10%. The lender's probably going to say, I'm not lending on this house until it's back to its original condition, because it's damaged and it affects the value. And I don't know that once I lend on this, that the buyer is actually going to fulfill the obligation, right? So I will say, even though this 10% is in here, unless you have a cash buyer that is buying a property and they are willing to accept the insurance proceeds and renegotiate after damage, you're probably not going to use this section at all. You're probably going to have a dead deal. Okay. Just that's some background. I don't know that'll happen in every situation, but I can tell you that we would have been better off to take that house off the market, have it fixed, and then put it back on the market and let this buyer buy it. That's what we should have done. All right, so representations and disclaimers. This is just saying that the property, we've seen this before in our purchase agreement, that everything is as is in a present physical condition. So any defects, things like that. And I think the biggest thing that we miss on here when we're writing this, or that the buyer understands, is that when the buyer is accepting this, it does say on line 117, they are also accepting all the defects that the seller has disclosed on the residential property disclosure form. Because what happens is we're seeing where buyers are going, oh, well, there's water in the basement and I want that fixed. You knew there was water in the basement because it was on the RPD. It's not our fault that you decided to just say, I'm going to move forward anyway, and now you want $10,000 to fix it. You accepted it when you accepted and signed that. Now, I'm not telling you that a buyer can't still back out and threaten you and say, I'm not going to close on this if we don't do something. What I am saying is, it is our duty to make sure that when we're writing this offer, we're explaining to our buyers, you are accepting this property in its as-is present physical condition, including all of the defects the seller has already disclosed. You don't have the right after a home inspection now to come back and say, oh, well, it needs a new roof, even though the seller told you it needed a new roof, right? These are things that you were aware of, and you made the offer based on your consideration of the defects the seller disclosed. So again, that's not necessarily new, but I'm pointing it out because I'm seeing a lot of that where people are trying to come back. How people fill out the property disclosure form too, I want to go over, is not up to us. Do I like it when an investor says, I've never lived in the property, and X's every single page and puts, I've never lived in the property, and signs it? No. Do I think that they should fill it out? I do. Can I make them fill it out? No. Can you? Absolutely not. We are not allowed to tell a client how to fill out a property disclosure form. The reason I bring this up is because I know that, and I'm not trying to say another, I won't even say the name of the brokerage, but there's another brokerage that will, their agents, because their ownership has told them, oh no, you have to fill this out in a certain fashion or we won't accept it for compliance. Well, I don't know what to tell you. Then don't accept it for compliance, because we are not legally allowed to tell a seller how to fill out that form. So don't call me and say, well, it's not filled out, you have to have your seller fill it out. No, we don't. So you can ask the seller if they would kindly fill it out to the best of their ability, and what they do with it is up to them. Okay, yes.
So just as an example, let's say on the property disclosure, my seller discloses, we've had 2 sewer backups in the last 5 years. And then buyer comes, does a sewer scope, and you need a new line to the road. And then they ask for that to get replaced. The seller can say, well, no.
Well, the seller didn't disclose that the sewer line needed replaced. The seller wasn't aware the sewer line needed replaced. They
Okay.
disclosed that the sewer line backed up, right? That's what they
Okay.
disclosed. So if you have an inspection to say what the problem is, and now you can identify what the problem is, great. But that would be like saying, my furnace has gone out on me twice, but I've never had it looked at. Well, now I have an HVAC person coming in to look at it. Now I need to get it repaired. That's acceptable. But they
For
don't
a
know what,
new problem.
I'm
But
sorry.
Like a new problem that's discovered through the inspection.
Right, because that's a
process. Okay.
problem. The seller may say that the sewer line backed up, but I didn't do anything about it. Or I had it snaked, but I never had it cambered, right? They didn't identify the problem. They just said that they had it snaked. So you would be allowed to do a sewer scope if you have it as part of an inspection. What I'm saying is things that are obvious, something like, you know, whether it's the roof needing replaced or they disclose that they've had several problems with the air conditioner, right? It's the air conditioner is 30 years old and I've had problems with it. I've had it serviced twice. It's broken. Now all of a sudden the buyer comes back and goes, you know, after this home inspection, I want a new air conditioner because it's broken twice. You disclosed it and it's 30 years old. I told you it was 30 years old on the disclosure. What new evidence do you have that supports that I need to replace the air conditioner?
Yeah.
You knew that. The sewer, I can't see underground. Same thing with a septic. I can't see underground. I don't know what's there. So if you're bringing new information, that's a different story.
And that's all helpful stuff to be able to say to your seller, if you're protecting, and we do say that to our sellers,
Yeah.
like you protect yourself by disclosing what you know. Because
Right.
then-
Yeah, disclose everything you know. And don't ask me how to disclose it, just disclose it. That's what I'm.
But just, can you go back and talk a little bit about when your investor doesn't wanna fill it out? That the jeopardy that they put themselves in is, that most people don't know, is that the buyer can void the contract then at any time during the transaction because it's not filled out. So we
Up until the
can't-
day of closing.
Yeah.
The buyer
so
can walk
We can't
away.
make them, so I'm Mr. Seller, it's fine, you don't wanna fill it out because you never lived there, I understand, but let me tell you what could happen.
Yeah.
The buyer has the right then to void the contract all the way to the day, even after closing date.
Yeah, and there's no repercussions. That's the thing is for the buyer. Normally, there are repercussions if you cancel a sale during the purchase agreement time. But if I'm a buyer that's my exemption is if you didn't fill out the property disclosure form or didn't provide me with one, I have the right to walk away up until the very day of closing without any repercussions. Has it been tested? I don't know. I've not seen it actually tested or not, but that is the repercussion. And so, what is the repercussion from a seller not filling out a property disclosure form and you still closing on it? Buyer beware, right? I mean, that because now you've got a lawsuit that you're gonna have to go after the seller and prove that they did know something or didn't know something. And that's why, to Lynette's point, disclose it. Whatever you know, disclose it. It's better. I'm gonna give you, for instance, one of the things that I think that you should also discuss. When I say disclose everything, that's what you really need to narrow down to a seller and give them the story and whatever story you want, but I give you this story. This brokerage just ended up paying with one of our agents $8,000. We were sued for $15,000 for something that we had nothing to do with over a property disclosure form because the seller had fleas in their house. And they didn't disclose it on the property disclosure form that in the last year they had had the property treated for fleas. Now, is there somewhere on there that says fleas specifically? There is not. Did she know that she had the property treated for fleas by Terminex? Yes, she did. She chose not to disclose it. She did not tell our agents. We had multiple showings on the property. We had closing, we had home inspection, all that stuff. After the buyer got into the property, her and her son were eaten alive when they tried to pull up the carpet, and that was their intent, was to pull up the carpet and get rid of it. She wanted to go with the hardwood floors or whatever was under there. Well, I saw the pictures. I mean, these people had welts on them. I mean, they were eaten and bitten and it was bad. And they ended up trying to sue for $15,000 and they sued us and the seller. But of course they sued us because we have an E&O insurance policy and they're like, oh, I can get money from this. When I tell you, I could not believe what they were suing for when I read the documents. I mean, you're talking about replacing baseboards. We had to pay $200 for a vacuum cleaner, doctor visits. I mean, you name it, whatever it took to clean up these fleas and the treatments on top of that. We ended up settling, but nonetheless, it cost the brokerage $8,000. So That costs the agent and us. So I say to you, when you explain to your sellers, I can't help you fill out that residential property disclosure form. You need to fill out every single thing that you can possibly think that happened to this property. Period. Because if it matters to a buyer, it should be on that form. Yes,
Question, so if you do have one of those people that fill out the the RPD and cross everything out and then sign it, are you then marking line 136 or 137?
you received it.
But it says received and reviewed the completed.
It is completed, but it doesn't say how it's completed. That's what I don't like about it,
Okay.
is completed could be crossing it out and just saying never lived in the home. We are not allowed to tell a client how to complete it. We're instructing them to please do it to the best of your ability. Everything you know about this property, disclose. If they choose not to, it's completed in their eyes. They completed it.
All right.
It's how they completed it that we don't like. And that's why I say to you that we have a brokerage that'll say it's not completed, it needs to be completed. Well, it's completed to that seller because they wrote on it that they never lived in the property and that's what their completion is.
I think for me, the question becomes, if it's all crossed off and then my. You know, if my buyer truly has the right to walk away based on a form that was filled out like that, it seems then like maybe am I doing a disservice by checking that I've received it? Do you see, I think
That's
that,
kind
for
of
me,
my
that was
thought.
I had the
Yeah.
same question.
I mean, I can understand the problem is the second one you would say has not, it would say the offer is subject to the seller delivering to the buyer a copy of the completed form. So I'm gonna ask you the question, are you gonna go all the way to 3 days after you've negotiated this offer for the seller to say, I'm not filling something out any differently than what I gave you the first time? Now you've just wasted 3 days of your buyer's time. So I mean, there's not really a way, you can't make a seller fill something out that they won't fill
I
out.
get it, I do, it's just kind of
Yeah, it was just-
disappointing to me.
A question, I think.
Maybe you're not representing the seller or buyer completely, fully, 100% if you're saying, well,
That we
yeah, we got it.
Yeah.
And we did, and it's completed, I understand the semantics, I do, and I'm not arguing, it's just kind of disappointing to me.
But I also think, Linda, to that point, you could say to them, listen, I understand this filled out, but the buyer is not gonna sign this. The buyer's not, they're gonna sign the offer, and we're actually gonna say that we received it, but it was not completed. There's nothing that says that you couldn't cross that out and say uncompleted or not completed.
Yeah, I've
you know,
had- I've
document.
had that conversation with particular, I'm sure we know exactly
Yeah.
what brokerage we're talking about, cause they do a lot of investors, and it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's just.
I think there are a lot of rule changes that need to come about in our industry, to be very honest with you. I think that there should be a reason, if a seller doesn't fill out a property disclosure form, they probably shouldn't be allowed to sell their house. Right? I mean, it's required by law, but it also doesn't say what the consequence is if they don't
Just because
fill
they
it
haven't
out.
lived there doesn't mean they don't know a lot
That's right.
about the house.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
If you owned a property,
Yeah.
chances are you know about it.
Right, and they can answer
There's
no
only two
to the
reasons why you're
questions.
checking the box. The second one, which is if it's exempt, we're checking that, yes.
Right, if it's exempt, but
And it gives, most of the time it's gonna be the agent didn't upload it on the MLS, and that's why we're giving them 3 days, right? So
yes,
if it's exempt, we're not checking one, which is we received it. in
Right.
lieu of
if it's
exemption.
really exempt, it's line 137.
And they
You
have
may
to-
not know it's exempt.
Right.
That's the thing. You don't know if it's exempt if the agent hasn't provided one or an exemption form.
If they did provide an exemption form,
Oh.
are we still checking 2 or 1?
If you can check number 2, which is line 137, because the exemption form is not a required form by the state of Ohio. That was something that the Ohio Realtors designed so that agents and clients understand why there's not a property disclosure form. So that's part of the problem with the law too, is the law says every seller is supposed to fill out a property disclosure form unless they are one of the 7 exemptions. But it doesn't give you a form to say, oh, no, wait, I'm exempt, that's why I didn't fill one out. You just don't have one. So that's why Ohio Realtors said, wait a minute, let's come up with a form so that the agent and the buyer understand why there's not a form. But that would be line 137.
But then you have to mark out within 3 days, because they're not going to
No, because
provide one.
it says unless the sale of the property is exempt.
Exempt, oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay,
so,
I see that.
so line 139 states that if it's exempt, you won't
Okay.
get one. But it's saying you haven't received one. That's the main thing. Anything else on that? I know it's semantics, Lyndon, I get it.
What if the seller has lived there for 70 years?
Mhm.
do they disclose something that happened 65 years ago? I was under the impression that it was like within a certain, like within the last 10 years.
And you know why you're under that impression? Because
don't know.
most agents are under that
Yeah.
impression, because if you read the residential property disclosure form, there are couples, only like 2 sentences, 2 questions say in the last 5 years or last 10 years. The whole document does not say in the last 10 years. It's specific questions that say something about 5 or 10 years. And I only know that because the attorneys expressed this to us so many times that I was under the same impression that you are, that if it didn't happen in the last 5 or 10 years, you didn't have to disclose it. That is not the case. So, I mean, if they had, you know, on 1970, maybe after they built the house, the walls started to bow in the basement and they know that it did, even though they fixed it, that should be disclosed. If they had water problems in the basement and they had it fixed, that should be disclosed. There are a lot of things, even like a fire, a small fire, that should be disclosed. Something where a roof damage and water came in, because insurance companies keep records and the world is becoming much smaller place with all these online records. And you might, as a seller, say, oh no, because you didn't remember that 15 years ago, part of your roof blew off during a storm and rain came in around the chimney and damaged, around the fireplace. But the insurance company remembers because they paid the claim out on it. And when they go to run that new insurance, it comes up that there was a claim that long ago and they can disclose a clue report to the buyer and the buyer can go, aha, you lied. So yes, everything should always be disclosed. None of us are ever going to be perfect. We're always going to forget things. Even if I were selling my own house, I am sure I am not going to remember all of the things that have happened. You have to do the best that you can when you're filling it out as the seller.
Quick
Yeah.
question.
All right. We did leave in there where the seller,
Megan has a question.
yes, go ahead.
So if you buy the house and things were found on the,
Hey, Megan, we can't hear you.
Inspection.
Can you just type it in the chat and I'll ask it for
yeah,
you?
sorry.
We'll keep going until the question's in the chat there.
Mhm.
We did leave in there about where a gas line that's found between the street and the house, that's gonna be taken care of. Whoever owns the house at that time, it's either closing or the restoration of utilities, which is ever sooner. You're gonna find that that sentence is very important when you start selling foreclosed houses, because before the house closes, if you have the utilities turned on and you realize there's a gas line leak, you're gonna be thankful the seller's the one that has to pay for it and not the buyer after closing. Because if it's after closing, it's the buyer's responsibility. And you'll learn that as we start to see more foreclosures.
Although, be careful with foreclosures because they have their addendum.
Oh, yeah.
It supersedes our contract.
Yeah.
And if they have in there that they're not doing it, it's not.
Right, you'll just have a dead deal as well
Yeah.
happen, but the buyer won't be forced to buy the house.
Right, right.
So, but yeah, good to know. All right, and then inspections, this is really where we made some of the most significant changes is after this paragraph where the inspections are. So we left that, it has to be a licensed home inspector, and I think that I want to just take the time to remind everybody here that that word is licensed home inspector. Uncle Bob cannot do it. Uncle Greg, that's a licensed electrician or a licensed contractor as a general contractor. No, they cannot do a home inspection. It has to be licensed. The person must be licensed with the Division of Real Estate. And if you are recommending anything other than a person that is licensed with the Division of Real Estate, that will come back to bite you in the rear end because you will be the one found guilty of basically giving a green light for somebody to go into a property that they don't have the right to do. There are liabilities that are involved with getting up on roofs, changing, out furnace filters and doing things like that. Like you have to make sure that the person is licensed and bonded. So just make sure that you're not letting, it's your duty to not let Uncle Joe come in the property. I mean, I've seen some of our own agents that have called me and said, well, no, we didn't have a general home inspection, but Uncle Bob went into the house, but they didn't pay him for it. Uncle Bob isn't a home inspector, and if they gave him anything of value, that's breaking the law. And also, Uncle Bob's knowledge of the hot water tank being the flue wrong is not the same as a home inspector. So good luck trying to get the seller to do something based on Uncle Bob. So just make sure that you are on both sides of this contract doing the right thing, which is a licensed home inspector.
I have Megan's question.
Oh, go ahead.
She says,
Do things need to be disclosed when selling that were found when purchased, such as termites were found during purchase and fixed during the purchase, or an electrical issue was found and fixed during the purchase? Do these things need to be disclosed when selling?
Absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, especially at termites, I mean, a seller would then have personal knowledge of damage from termites. And a buyer may need to continue to have termite treatments done on the house so it doesn't happen again. But they also need to know how it was treated, because we have subterranean termites. If it was a liquid treatment, it may never need treated again. If it was bait stations around the house, you may have to keep up with those. And if you remove them, you might get termites again. So it should always be disclosed, especially with destroying insects, but even an electrical problem. I mean, something, I can't say that you shouldn't disclose that the breakers were double tapped when I bought the house, but I had it fixed. I don't know that I would if I had it fixed, but damage to the property, yes, I would absolutely, whether it was fire, water, termites, something, yeah. Cause there's a history somewhere. Somebody's got that history and the neighbors will be all too happy to tell. So, all right, general home inspection. So I think based on one of these classes that we had, we did add septic system or sewer scope for blank days. I think that's a double-edged sword because it's gonna kill some deals, but I also think you're protecting your client, which is our job. So, you know, use that for how you want to, but that on line 2 there where it says septic system or sewer scope, you may not have a septic, but you might have a sewer. So it's gonna be either or, and it has to be done within so many days from acceptance. We did put back in there the well water with all 5 of the possible ways that the water can be tested, because with veterans, it is required that all 5 ways are tested. And also a buyer doesn't know that they might have all those options. And so it's good that it's on the contract that you can go over them, excuse me, with them. And then radon, we changed this a little bit. We just said that radon is still something that can be tested, but then if it is more than the 4 picocuries per liter, then the seller shall mitigate a cost not to exceed blank. We got rid of the other line where if it was more, then who pays for it and things like that. A lot of times I know I fill this out and the listing agent will send it back and be like, we'll split it 50-50. So the seller won't pay it, but we're designing this to try and get our buyers taken care of. So that's why we have it in there. But when you receive it, know that it's in there that we're asking the seller to pay for all of it.
I think it's important to note that it says and buyer agrees to close. You know, when I'm describing all my inspections to my buyer, I'm saying, so after we do these inspections, we have 3 options. Ask them to repair it.
Yeah.
Sometimes they give money back, or we can walk away, right? That's not true.
Not for
radon.
Not for radon, because there are people that say, oh, there's a, let's just call it 24 picocuries or whatever, and I just don't want the house now. Okay, first of all, you had no idea that that was in the house because you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't taste it. People have lived in this house for how long? You may be a firm believer in radon where others are not. So it can be arbitrary. And that's why the attorney left in there agrees to close, is because if the seller is gonna mitigate it and it's gonna bring it below 4, which is the legal limit, how can you then say, I'm not gonna buy the house? Whether it has a radon mitigation system in it or doesn't, as long as the level is below 4, that is what the EPA allows. So that's why it says in there that they agree to close, yes. But you will still find buyers that will say, I don't want to close because I don't want to buy a house with radon. Good luck buying a house.
Yeah. I have a question about the other line.
Okay, the other, yes.
So when.
I have a feeling I'm gonna answer this question. Don't ask your question yet.
Okay.
The reason I say that is because I told you we changed quite a bit of this afterwards, and I think you're gonna be quite pleased. To where the other box, thank God, will never have to be used again as the broker does look at it, that says any inspection recommended by home inspector. I don't ever want to see that again in our purchase agreement, and I've never wanted to see it, even though agents continue to do it. You don't have a reason to do it now because we fixed it, I think. All right. So line 169, this is where it starts the changes. The parties may agree in writing to extend the dates for inspections, which we always knew that you could, but this is letting people know you in fact can extend the days for inspections in the event that there are things that you need to inspect further. If it is a roof, if it is an HVAC, if it is mold, whatever, so you can agree. But then basically the biggest thing is here on line 177, we shortened this paragraph where it says, within 3 days after the completion of the last inspection that was elected above, the buyer can choose one of the following. We are used to accepting it as is. We are used to accepting it and asking for repairs, and we are used to terminating. That paragraph is a lot smaller than what it used to be, because the next paragraph is where we added kind of, I guess, the teeth, basically, if you will. So if something wasn't previously disclosed, then obviously you can ask the seller to fix it, right? So not if it was previously disclosed, but if it wasn't, you have the right to do it. And then we said that the parties shall have the 3 days from the seller's receipt. You're gonna need to provide the home inspection report. You still have to, that was in our old one, it is in the new one. You have to provide the home inspection report, or at least the pertinent pages. But it does say that if you're gonna terminate this agreement, you are disclosing all of the reasons why, which is giving that inspection report, okay? So I know a lot of times agents and buyers hate to do that, but you don't have a choice. You have to give it, and that was in our last purchase agreement, even though agents would fight it, you still have to do it. All right, and then the buyers who perform the inspections, if there is more detailed inspection, including any of the above, I'm sorry, I'm skipping around, but line 172. If any of the inspectors who have performed an inspection recommendation or recommend a more detailed inspection, including any of the above not specified, so not what was already elected by the buyer, or if additional inspections are required by the lender, then the buyer will notify the seller in writing within 3 calendar days from the date of the completion of the last inspection, and the buyer shall have an additional 7 calendar days from the date to notify for the completeness of the inspection. So that's why I say to you, I think that we've somewhat fixed what you are normally looking for in that other box. So this now says, no matter what the home inspector finds, if the home inspector recommends other detailed inspections, whether it was a sewer scope, even though that wasn't elected, whether it was mold, even though it wasn't elected, that you have 7 calendar days to perform those inspections, and the seller is agreeing to that up front. That's part of the purchase agreement.
Paid by the buyer.
Well, the buyer would have to pay for their
Okay.
inspections. I mean, yeah, we can't say that the seller, that'd be writing a blank check to a seller, and if I were a seller, or I'm sorry, from the seller, and if I were a seller, I wouldn't say, oh yeah, sign me up for $2,000 worth of inspections that the guy's gonna recommend. Because how easy would that be? Not saying that home inspectors would do that, but if I were a home inspector, I don't know what the contract says, but it's like, oh, I have 7 extra days for all these inspections, sign me up, and by the way, this is all the inspections I do. You know,
My question is more so,
okay,
I'm glad that our contract says this, but others don't.
nope,
So like on my listing, I had where somebody checked this, any recommended by home inspection or by home inspector within 7 days of the recommendation. And they snuck in a sewer scope on the day of the general home inspection. And I said, where did this come from? There's nowhere in our contract. And he said, well, it was recommended.
the thing is
Like, it's always recommended.
everything is always
Yeah,
recommended.
exactly. So
That's
it's like-
exactly right. That's why I hate the wording. I hate when we write it in. I hate writing this in now because, that it's typed in there now is simply because a home inspector's job is to make sure that the buyer is buying a property that is sound and safe and secure, right? They're only doing their job typically. Now, I know that there are some home inspection companies out there, they'll be like, okay, well, I'm running a special today, or I'm running a special that week that I can do a sewer scope and I can do radon and I can do all these things. That's great, but that's not what we talked about. So unfortunately, when you're on that end of it, it really comes down to, did the seller accept the way that that was written? Did you accept it? Then if you did, the buyer has the right to make any inspection that the home inspector recommended, right? How do you say no? Now, the interesting thing is a sewer scope you can't see, like you can't see the sewer without a scope. It's the same thing with radon. You can't see it without the test. Why wouldn't it be marked on there if they wanted it?
Mhm.
It's because the home inspector upsold them or had them concerned about the sewer for whatever reason. Right? I mean, it's not because they were just like, oh, well, let me make money today. It was because the home inspector is like, hey, I can't see underground. This is really in your best interest. They upsold it, but now it's recommended. So they can do it. That's why I don't like the word recommended. I don't like the word required. I don't like, if it's not written in here, to me, you shouldn't be allowed to do the inspection.
Well, there should be because it's evidence of something they're seeing,
Sure.
now they're recommending. So I see the roof looks blah, blah, blah,
That's
and
different.
recommending a roofer to come.
Yeah.
But I think people don't know what to say under other, because they're trying to wrap their brain, what could it be? So here's an example, the house has a pool,
Right.
and I want a pool inspection, something to that effect.
Or the furnace is 20 years old and I want an HVAC inspection
That's what I just-
specifically.
Yeah.
I just had that, like, they didn't have any inspections, but the furnace was a concern for them, so they wrote in other, an inspection of the furnace.
Yeah.
And that was it, another.
And I've had people just do a pool inspection. That's all they cared about. And I put that under other. I mean, that's what other is designed for, is something specific outside of a general knowledge of a home inspection.
It doesn't mean other after.
No, it doesn't mean that.
Other, meaning I don't have a place to put it, so now I have a blank, like,
But-
now, like type of thing.
But we've turned it into that, and so in
Yes.
order to try and protect everybody from writing in other, anything recommended by the home inspector. It's really a conversation that says, okay, if the home inspector recommends that we do this, we do have an additional 7 days. I'm gonna tell you right now, listing agents are gonna hate this. Sellers are going to hate it. But I was gonna bold it and the attorney thought, no, we're gonna bold the next one, not that one, so that's what we did instead, but I'm pointing it out to you because I feel like it gives a little bit more teeth for you so that you're not writing something in. It gives the home inspector the right to recommend something and keep your client protected, because that was the argument that I had with agents all the time is, you know, if you didn't have it in there, they're like, well, then how can they test for mold? How can they do that? Because the home inspector saw something and is telling you there's a reason to do another inspection. It's not like radon where it's like, I can't see it. There's really not a reason to do that extra inspection unless you believe that radon exists. But a home inspector can't be like, well, I see the paint chipping on the wall, so I think you should do a radon inspection, or I smell it in the air. There's no reason for that, right? It's just a recommendation and protection, so.
I think of if you're gonna do more inspections, I think of it as when you've done your general, something has come up that has
Yes.
caused the buyer concern, and now. I'm not sure that I wanna move forward unless I can know more about the specific problem that the inspector found, and it's more of a point of negotiation at that. Moment than to say, well, if I can look at it further and be reassured, I'll move forward, if not, I'm out, that's how I
And
think
that's
of
the way
those.
it was designed, but that is not the way that
It's
it's been,
used, yeah.
been used. Yes. So are we clear then on understanding that you can extend on line 169, you can extend the dates of the inspections if you need to, or you have an additional 7 calendar days from the date of the notification for that last inspection if the inspector says there's something else needed. So you have 2 options. And I would say if you're going to get estimates on repairs, you need to elect lines 169 through 171, which is getting extension. Because not oftentimes am I seeing agents writing ROCs properly. They're writing them to where it's like, well, have the HVAC cleaned and inspected, and then we'll renegotiate after we find out. I'm not signing that, but you'd be amazed at how many buyers and sellers are signing it on the election of their agent, so. I say to you, you know, extend the inspection period if there is further inspections needed and you want estimates, because only then can you do an ROC that would say. Buyer wants the seller to replace the air conditioning or whatever at a cost of $3,500, or I want a credit of $3,500, or whatever the case is. But to be determined later is a disaster. Don't do it. You're just opening your buyer up to possibly not even closing on the house because the seller is not obligated to pay for anything just because you got an estimate. Okay? So I feel like that was a little bit a step in the right direction, if you will. Like I said, lines 185 through 197, it's basically the same thing. It's just saying that, you know, if within those 3 days after the ROC is given, if we can't get something together, then the buyer or seller can terminate the agreement based on the new evidence or not coming to an agreement. We left in the limited home warranty part of that, so you can put in there whatever home warranty company. We put in there the tenant occupied. I think that the thing that is interesting about this tenant occupied is agents, when you're selling a tenant occupied property, If you're not getting a copy of the lease that was signed, you are doing a disservice to your buyer. Because you have no idea how long that buyer is actually allowed, or I'm sorry, that tenant is allowed to stay in the property and how long the lease is. I'm gonna give you, for instance, that we just had, one of our, listing agents did provide a lease by a management company, only it was the renewal lease. It was not the original lease. So there was an original lease for a term of 1 year. During that 1 year, $900 deposit was collected on behalf of the tenant, right? So the landlord held that. Well, the next year, when they did the renewal, they put a dash through the deposit, because why would the tenant give a second deposit when you already gave the first one and all I'm doing is a renewal, right? But they didn't write in there $900 deposit was already being held, it's just a renewal. So the only lease that we got was the second lease that showed the renewal. Now, we had no idea that was a renewal because we didn't know the first one existed. We sold the property. The tenant then said, why didn't I get credit for the $900 deposit that I gave to the new landlord? Because the new landlord's like, I want a deposit. And they said, well, I gave $900. Well, no, you didn't. Where's the paperwork? Thankfully, in this case, the tenant had the paperwork that showed that they did give the $900, but it was about 3.5 weeks and the buyer was livid, the tenant was livid, and they really weren't given the right information. And I'm not saying that was the listing agent's fault, but what I'm saying to you is do your job and make sure that you have the most current lease. Is there a deposit? Is there proof of a deposit? If you've got to talk to the tenant to figure out if there's a deposit or that, you know, it was ever paid or how much, do it. Because it does matter. We're giving credits on settlement statements for these things, and the buyers may or may not be getting credit on the settlement statement. So, contingent upon the closing of the buyer's current house currently under contract, we left that in there on lines 205 through 211. The walkthrough, I had an interesting question the other day, and I don't remember, one of the agents texted and said, is a walkthrough, was that you? A walkthrough, is it automatically assume that a buyer can do a walkthrough before closing? And the answer is no. If it's not written on a document somewhere that the buyer and seller agree to let them in the house, you're not doing one. Ours is written in there, and it does say that the buyer has the opportunity within 1 to 3 days prior to the closing date to walk through. Now, it also does go on, and I think the important part of this is to say, if there is anything that's changed in the property, usually the first thing the buyer wants to do is say, I'm not closing. Well, that's not what this document says. It says that the buyer and the seller will agree to an amount of money to rectify the situation. So if the buyer acknowledges and agrees that the buyer may not raise any new issues, or I'm sorry, any existing issues about the property, only new issues that would be existed. And so if the walkthrough identifies a material change in the property's condition, the buyer shall promptly notify the seller and escrow agent in writing, and the parties shall mutually agree in writing upon a dollar amount to be held either in escrow. It does not say the buyer has the right not to close, because then the buyer can be sued for specific performance because they're not closing on the property. We don't want to get our buyer in trouble. Now, if something is so bad that the damage is beyond belief, I'm sure that the buyer is not going to move forward and say, I'm not going to close, that no amount of money will work. But typically, if we're talking about a scratch floor, a hole in the wall, something like that, that is something that they can put money in escrow. It can be fixed after closing, and any additional money can be sent back to the seller. But it does not give the right to the buyer to say, I'm not closing.
I have a Zoom question. It says, if the home inspector states that the roof needs further inspection and we need to get a roofer out there, are we correct in understanding that we do not need to extend the inspection window as long as we get it done within these 7 additional days?
Right, you have 7 additional days, that's correct.
Okay.
Yep. And hopefully you can get it done in that time frame. But that also doesn't mean that you can. And if you choose not to elect the extension, you know, if the seller doesn't want to sign an extension, that's all you have is 7 days, that's it. So if it goes beyond 7 days, you've now just harmed the buyer because you didn't get an extension. So I would not rely on those 7 days unless you absolutely know for certain that you can get a roofer or whatever out there and come to some type of estimate also for the repair. Those are the important things. You might be able to get a roofer out there who says, yeah, you need a new roof, and now I need 3 quotes, right? So there would be a difference. Any additional terms, usually we don't see additional terms, but we did leave a small section for that. Everything is confidential that your buyer wants to be confidential. What is with you? What is not confidential is the moment you give this offer to the listing agent. The listing agent nor the seller have any obligation to keep your client's offer quiet. So I say that if Linda gives me an offer and Diana gives me an offer, and they are $2,000 apart. And my seller, Lynette, says, Rich, go back to the other buyer because they aren't offering, they're not doing any home inspections. Linda's people are, Diana's people aren't, but they're $2,000. If they'll give me that $2,000, I'll take their offer. Then my client has told me I have the right to go only back to Diana and say, if you give me $2,000 more, we will take your offer. And if she comes up to that, you're out, you're in. I did nothing wrong. My client instructed me to do that. A lot of times agents think that when I give an offer, that my offer is confidential only in the seller's eyes, and that's all who gets to look at is the listing agent and the seller. That's not true. If your seller tells you to shop that offer, you go shop that offer. Okay, so it's not confidential. Authorization just says, again, that the escrow officer is allowed to give us the settlement statement so that we can review those, hopefully before closing, not at the day of closing, so you have time. The binding agreement changed a little bit. This used to say, you know, it was a binding agreement, and basically it was a big paragraph that had made a buyer think that they were forced into buying a property that they never followed anyway. So this was changed up a little bit, and it just says that acceptance, it explains what acceptance is, which is everybody signing. And then it's understood and agreed that the brokers and agents involved in the transaction don't have the authority to bind a buyer and a seller to a purchase of a sale. That is something that's important for you to understand, even though you may think that you understand it. I think in all very early in our real estate careers, we think that by saying this is a binding agreement, that we can actually force a buyer to buy and a seller to sell. That couldn't be further from the truth. It doesn't matter why the buyer doesn't want to buy or why the seller doesn't want to sell. It doesn't matter that the buyer needs the property and the seller has lived in it for 70 years and now all of a sudden is pulling at their heartstrings to sell it. None of that matters. You cannot force these people to buy and sell. So it's just letting everybody know that though we have the best of intentions, it's a binding agreement. We are real estate agents, not attorneys. We can't force anybody to do anything. Okay. So that's just important for you to go over with your client, because everybody thinks, oh, I signed on the dotted line, my house is closing. Well, no, until you have the money, don't say your house is closed, because it's not. We did leave the dower interest in there and electronic data security, put back in there. The addendums, we did not add in there that the buyer broker compensation agreement is a separate addendum. If you want to put that under other, you can. It is not a required document by the state. It is required by our brokerage that you have that, and that's the attorney didn't want it part of the contract because we've now already put in there at the top what the seller is paying in commission, if anything. And then the duration of the offer, we did go ahead and add that back in there. I think that was something that we had on the first page of the other offer, which didn't make a lot of sense. And then the signatures. So I feel like we put a lot of different things in here, a lot of the same, but there is different things in here, especially when it comes to the inspections. And it comes to the commission and the way that it will be paid. We went back to the title company that everybody liked the way it was. We went back to the deed and closing that everybody liked. Is there anything in there that you're like, and the 72 hours for the earnest money? Do we like the changes? Do we not like the changes? I'm happy to hear feedback. Yes.
I just have a question. I
Yeah.
know some of our agents do it where they will say, we can deposit the earnest money after inspection and they put it in the additional terms. Can they still do that? or
No. No, it's, first of all, we've never had that as an option, and let me tell you a bazillion whys that it's not a good reason, or it's not a good way to do it. After a home inspection, a buyer is feeling overwhelmed. They are feeling like they are buying a $300,000 POS, right? I mean, that's what they're thinking. And it's not the case, but that's what they think. So they're not so apt to be like, oh, here's my $500 or my $1,000. I mean, I've even seen where it's written within 72 hours and they stop payment on the check, you know, because of the home inspection. So we do not have that option. The only two companies I think that have that option are Remax, and I think there's two Remaxes that have it. I never allow my sellers to accept an offer that the earnest money is written after the home inspection.
We just had it in the additional terms before, and I think maybe the buyer was digging their heels a little. I'm not sure. I just know I've seen it on some of our
It's out there. I don't think that it holds a buyer to a purchase agreement at all. I mean, they're more apt to walk away, and that's not my job, is to not protect them, but I also think protecting them is keeping them in a contract that they signed to and being as good as their word. I hate the earnest money laws in Ohio. I think that they need to change. But for now, that's what they are. Yeah.
I have a Zoom question. Jessica Atkins is asking if we have seen non-refundable earnest money we have seen non-refundable earnest money be requested from other sellers agents lately. What is our KW policy on this?
So there is no policy. I mean, we have to follow what Ohio law is, and there is nothing that prevents a seller from saying, I want non-refundable earnest money. And I can't say I blame them. What our responsibility is as the agent is everywhere in this purchase agreement, which is like 3 or 4 places that says that the buyer and seller agree to sign a mutual release and return the earnest money to the buyer. You have to cross that out and everybody has to initial it, because you can't have a contract that contradicts itself. Because then what do you stand on when it comes time for the legalities of it? So if it says that if you're trying to change it to where the earnest money is non-refundable, then you're gonna go through our purchase agreement and cross out every place that it says it. And you're also gonna write in under additional terms that the earnest money is being written to the seller and it's non-refundable. And that's the way you would do it. I do recommend that if you're really trying to get your offer expressed, but I can also tell you that we had a $20,000 buyer that gave a $20,000, I'm sorry, not a $20,000 buyer, a buyer that was that confident to buy a house. They wrote a $20,000 earnest money check on like a $500 and some $1,000 house. And all of a sudden they decided that they didn't want it, and they now weren't gonna sign a mutual release because they wanted 10,000 of the 20,000 back. Well, it was non-refundable and the seller had it. And so they just waited till the clock ran out on the purchase agreement and relisted the property. And they were within every right to do that. So, you know, just because earnest money is non-refundable and your buyer thinks that they're buying the house, be careful, because if it's non-refundable, it's non-refundable.
She asks again, and the title company is still responsible for holding the earnest money, correct?
Nope. If it is non-refundable earnest money, the earnest money is written directly to the seller. There is no reason for anybody to hold it whatsoever because it's non-refundable. You're not getting it back. Yep. You might as well consider it gone. It's credited to the sale if you close, but otherwise it's gone. So.
Rich,
Lynette, you've been super quiet, so
Well,
either we get a bang up job or
Every time I know you were sick, so I feel like I gotta take it easy on you.
please do.
I was expecting the seller agrees to pay buyer broker commission thing. I was expecting a check mark. I was expecting a yes, or like, we can check yes, we can check no.
You don't
I
have to
have
fill it
sellers,
out.
I have buyers who are like, no, I'm gonna pay it because I want my.
Yeah, that's okay.
paperwork. I
The
would just
commission
strike
will
it.
be 0%. That's
Okay.
fine. Yep, absolutely.
Compensation form is
Couple.
Sure.
Sorry.
That's what we have for compensation.
The buyer broker compensation form, that's exactly right. That spells it out. But yeah, we got rid of the checkbox because it was like, it is contingent or it's not contingent.
Well, I
Well, you
didn't
don't
like
need a
contingent.
check.
I just wanted to be able to say seller agrees to pay buyer broker commission, yes or no, but
Well,
it's fine. I can
It
roll
says
with
that.
this. I like
says
it much
that.
better than it was.
I have another Zoom question.
ahead.
She said, so are we Venmoing the non-refundable earnest money to seller?
I don't know that I would be Venmoing, and especially depending upon what it is. I mean, I've never used Venmo for earnest money, nor would I recommend it. I mean, I think that if you're going to pay a seller and I'm gonna give them $1,000 or $500, I'm gonna go to my bank and get I'm gonna get a cashier's check that's traceable, that shows that I gave it and that I'm delivering it. What they do with it for my delivery is up to them. I could also ask the seller for wire instructions if I wanted to go that far and ask them, and I would have a record of it. But I would not recommend doing Venmo or Cash App or any other way to do it. And you want to make sure that the agents have a record of it, and that's kind of hard to do with Venmo unless you're relying on the seller and buyer to send you their records.
Oh, wait, we have more.
That's fine.
Oh, she asked if we can get on the mic, but for some reason you can't hear. But Jessica said, again, this was a real request from other agents in Mansfield this week.
What was a real request?
Venmo.
To Venmo it?
I'm assuming.
And that could be, I mean, that would just be very odd to me. I'm not saying that you can't do an electronic transfer. There's nothing that says it has to be a check. But if I'm turning over money, I want a record of it better than Venmo. So that's just me.
Rich, I would just add, I guess, for things like, all those check marks of things that are and not attached, like, to me, I think, like, the sump pump could be included in the, like, if there's one, it should stay. I don't wanna have to try to
Well,
remember, was there a sump pump or not? I don't know.
Yeah, and most of the time, when the sump pump is gonna stay, you're not digging that out of the ground to take it with you. I don't know why they chose to do some that are chattel, not affixed to the property. I mean, to me, a smart or electronic thermostat is probably attached to the property.
So are the
Right.
glass fireplace
Oh, you'd be-
doors, I would say.
I
Do
know,
you know how many wanna take their ring door?
I know they do, because they're like, oh, it's double-sided tape or whatever, I know. And I don't disagree, the same thing with window air conditioners, I mean. Most of the time, they're in the window is closed around them. If you take it out, you're gonna know that there's an air conditioner missing.
Another Zoom question, Rachel says, okay, is ASHI certified home inspector okay, or home inspections need to be certified by the state?
Yeah, an ASHI home inspection person is somebody that got an extra education and is part of something like the National Association of Realtors, that's ASHI, right, Linda, is that?
American Society of Home
Thank you.
Inspectors.
So I mean, so it's just like NAR is for realtors. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily licensed in the state of Ohio. You can get on the e-license lookup and make sure that your home inspector is licensed in the state of Ohio. And like I said, it's not necessarily your job to make sure that every single person is licensed walking in the house. I don't expect you to look up every single home inspector or whatever, but when you are the one giving the inspector's name, you need to make sure that they are in fact licensed. Just because they've been doing it for 30 years doesn't mean that they're licensed.
Oh, you're scaring me.
Well, it is scary because if you,
My list, but I'm like, what if someone down that list is not actually
yeah, because if
licensed?
you give somebody the idea to go into a property that they're not licensed, you are liable for that.
I think the majority of our
The people who are
inspectors
using it
around
are-
here
yeah,
are
something.
licensed.
Just assume that one.
Right.
And some of them are, there are a couple of companies though that have a couple inspectors on their staff that are not themselves licensed.
Yeah, and the same thing would be true too. Our license have to be renewed, yes? Well, what happens when somebody forgets to renew their license and they don't remember, but they're out doing a home inspection on a property and their license expired last week and they haven't got the thing in the mail to say that it's expired, right? I mean, sadly, we're still recommending these people. It's the same thing with us. I mean, you'd be amazed at how many agents don't remember their birthday, that their license expired. And then 3 weeks later, we get a thing in the mail that say you've been practicing real estate and you don't have a license. Well, the moment we know it, you're done. You can't do anything. Well, now you have pending deals and you still want to practice. That's not our problem. So same thing with the home inspector, like they may still want to do the home inspection, but they're not licensed. So you do have to be careful.
They have the same process we do in a lot of ways. They have continuing ed, they have to take.
Yeah.
They have their requires, they have to take, and then they have the license renewal.
So I'm just thinking with the change to the paragraph about that we are, no matter what, we are asking for commission.
Yeah.
Does that change the buyer broker additional document in the sense of this, like, so let's say that my buyer is like, I'm paying the commission, let's not even put it in there, I want my offer to be more competitive, right? So I think it's good for my buyer to see that buyer broker compensation form, but I don't know that I need the seller to know that my buyer, you know how we send that over a lot of
Yeah.
times with the purchase agreement, like if I'm not asking them to pay it, does it matter that they know how much my buyer is gonna pay? Like, you don't see what I'm saying?
Not necessarily, but there's also, I'm not sure what the harm is. I mean, I understand what you're saying. You're trying not to get the seller to know how much money the buyer is paying
It's
you.
just kind of none of their business, I guess, is how I think about it, but.
It isn't. I mean, you don't necessarily know how much the listing agent's getting paid and because that's on the listing agreement. So I can understand that. I guess I just don't. If I start to make an exception for those to where, oh yeah, you don't have to turn it in, you do have to turn it in, then it becomes a problem because now it's like we're chasing down the paperwork. It's like, if it's really a big deal that the seller knows that you're getting paid X and they have nothing to do with it, then they need to focus on something else in life, because it really doesn't make any sense. I mean, if Linda's paying something and I see that Linda's paying something, what do I care if it's not affecting me? It just doesn't make any sense. You're not sending them you're not sending them the buyer agency agreement. You're just sending them a form that says, everybody knows how we're getting paid here. And the seller is just confirming they're not paying.
Yeah,
I-
we've had list agents not sign it because they're not paying.
And that's fine.
Whatever, but they saw it, they still
Yeah.
got it, the seller still signed it, but the list agent refused.
It's the
Yeah, I
same
had
thing with
something
the,
in my pocket.
it's the same thing with the consumer guide, right? We have to provide it and ask for a buyer or a client to sign it. They can write refuse to sign on it and we can still move forward. What you can't have refused to sign on is a buyer agency agreement or a buyer agreement with the agency. That is not, there is no exemption in the law anywhere that says that a buyer can say to you, I'm not signing any written agency agreement with your company on compensation. There's no
No.
excuse.
What if we sign our buyer up, let's say, I'm just using hypothetical numbers, let's say we sign our buyer up, and they're gonna pay us 5% of our commission, right? And we go to the seller and say, okay, Mr. Seller, I want 5%, and the seller comes back and says, I will pay 2%.
Yeah.
And so now do I have to go back and amend and I'm willing to accept 2%, and I don't go to my buyer for it would be more normal if I said 3%, right? Okay, let me just say 3%.
I was
And my
still following.
seller says, the seller says, I will pay 2.5% towards your commission. My agreement with my buyer says 3%.
Yeah.
So maybe I go back to them and they pay my other 0.5%, fine, but if I just say, okay, I'll take 2.5%, do I need to do anything with that original contract? Am I okay to just move forward?
You're okay to move forward with the buyer broker compensation agreement. My only question, and it goes back to this too, is why would you not make the buyer pay that other 0.5%? In what world are you comfortable taking a discount on your commission like that when they signed up front knowing that they had to pay 3%? And why are you doing it for one, but you're not doing it for all? I mean, that goes back to the whole problem with the lawsuit is now you're just trying to accept whatever the seller is paying. Well, that completely circumvents the lawsuit. Like that was the whole point of the lawsuit was sellers should not be paying the compensation and also don't be offering blanket compensation. The agent and the buyer should be able to negotiate their compensation together. They shouldn't just get paid whatever the seller is asking.
Okay, and then what if you have a buyer who says, well, I don't care, I am not paying your commission? Like, if a seller isn't gonna pay your commission, then we're not doing a sale together.
Guess I'm not writing the offer, find yourself another agent.
And
Thanks for playing.
what if they're willing to sign the buyer agency agreement and you say, okay, so you sign it for your 3%, but they're like, but the seller's gonna have to pay this.
Yeah,
And then, so that, I think that's the scenario where you potentially end up at the mercy of what a seller is gonna offer. And then a whole nother thing for me is, we do go back to our seller for the rest of our commission when a buyer only says 2.5 or 2. So then I have what I have found is the listing agents go in and change that buyer broker and give me a 2.5% commission on the bottom line of that buyer broker, and I'm like, that's the wrong initials, because I'm actually having my buyer pay my other 0.5%.
Yeah.
So I've had to it just did a lot of back and forth initially, and I'm like, I'm just changing it. I don't care if your seller reinitials that my buyer is paying the rest of my commission or not. I know that's.
but if the seller is paying any portion of the commission, you have to have that buyer broker compensation agreement signed by the seller.
Well, and they do. So this is what happens, right? So I say 3%,
Yeah,
and then my brokerage fee, and then my total is 3% plus my brokerage fee. So then this little
seller
listing
counters.
agent, yes, they fix it on the purchase agreement, then they go top line, seller, they change my 3%, they slash it and they write 2.5%.
Yep.
Then they go to the final line and they say 2.5% plus brokerage fee. So now my buyer has to initial that. Well, but I don't want my buyer to see that, right? Because my buyer isn't getting off of not paying my 0.5%. So now I'm changing it again, I'm paying 0.5% for my buyer. My final line is still 3%.
Mhm.
So technically, the seller has to re-sign that. It's just a conversation I'm needing to remember to have with that listing agent to say,
Yeah.
please don't scratch out my bottom line. My buyer is actually gonna be the one paying my other percentage there. So
Yeah, and most agents,
it's
as
just
we
another
learn,
little nuance that
they
maybe
shouldn't
other people
be-
have had.
yeah, they shouldn't be crossing out your bottom line. And
Well,
I think
that's-
most
yeah.
agents, as they learn
Yeah.
that the seller is only paying this, they're not gonna cross out your total 3%.
Well, that's
at
what
the
they're
bottom.
doing, or that's been my experience on multiple occasions where I've had to
Yeah,
but it's me needing to have the conversation with that listing agent
It's
saying,
having
don't
a
cross it all off. When you fill it out, please put that the buyer's still paying the rest,
Yes.
yeah.
any other questions about the purchase agreement? Okay, well, you didn't throw anything, so I didn't hear any sighs. I guess it was better than what it used to be, so. This is in Dotloop, you can start using it. We are going to remove the other one today, the old one, so they were both in there just until today. But it will be removed. If you guys start using this, and like I said, there are issues or whatever, I mean, I don't wanna change a purchase agreement again, there's a lot of work that goes into this. But I still love having your feedback as you being out there writing these and having the other agents be receptive. Just know that you will probably not be liked a couple times when you point out that the home inspection the period extended by 7 days automatically. So you might want to bring that up.
I have a Zoom question.
Yeah.
Is an addendum acceptable for the non-refundable deposit and still held by the title company?
No. No, if it is non-refundable deposit, it does not get held by anybody, 0 peoples. It goes directly to the seller. Yep.
Got it.
It is non-refundable. I mean, it's like going to a slot machine and putting in a $100 bill. It's gone. Okay, thanks, guys. Thanks, everybody on Zoom.
Thanks, Rich.
Have a good day.
Yeah, all right, so.